episode of Made in America is brought to you by America's Inventor Lady and Home Talk USA. Home Talk is a proud member of the King's Broadcasting Network, which has been bringing you the best in home-based innovation since 1998.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being with us for this episode of Made in America.
Welcome back, everybody, to Home Talk USA on the King Broadcasting Network. This is the Made in America Hour, and I'm your host, Greg Owens, here with Scott Maier from Blue Star. Before we get with Scott, I'd like to give a shout out to our sponsor for this segment, Bond Products. For DIY carpet binding, there is only one InstaBind. You can find them at bondproducts.com. Scott, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you for having me.
It's our pleasure. And I like to start out, you're a new guest on our program, maybe one of several times you'll be able to join us. But why don't you start out by introducing yourself? Who's Scott and what is Blue Star? And sort of how did you get involved in the Made in America space?
Sure. So yeah, I'm Scott Maier, the CEO of Blue Star NBR. We are in the nitrile glove manufacturing space. We came about kind of in 2019, before the pandemic started. We knew of the supply chain issues that existed with the nitrile gloves, where, we were importing 99% of them. Majority were coming from Malaysia. And, for the buyers, it was a frustrating supply chain because, every quarter, one of the top manufacturers gets put in the penalty box by CPB because of the forced issues that go on in the Malaysian factories. So, the buyers are always having to keep extra inventory on hand, trying to figure out, okay, which shipment is going to get turned away at port? How do we, make sure we keep enough in stock so we don't have shortages? But, we knew that, this kind of complex supply chain for such a critical item, especially almost 100% of it, coming from one region just did not make sense. So we started to look to see, if the automation that is out there on the packaging side, which is really where all of the kind of, unskilled, low-cost labor ends up, being, if, that could be eliminated. And, it turns out there are systems to basically, take gloved off formers, stack them in a pile of 100, put 100 in a box, put 10 boxes in a case, and then put, a bunch of cases on a pallet. And, kind of looking at that, we basically saw that we could make gloves at a cost competitive price to, the Far East. For decades, pricing was around, 3.5 to 4 cents a glove. And we can absolutely make gloves in the US for that price. But, prior to the pandemic, trying to build a, state-of-the-art $150 million factory to make a 3.5 cent to 4 cent, commodity, zero investor appetite. Fast forward to the pandemic, put a spotlight on what we already knew, and the government, under Trump, the 1.0 administration started to take steps to reshore, a lot of these critical supply chains.
So just for the sake of our audience, I'm assuming these gloves are used in hospitals. Where are they used?
Yeah, they're so it's a lot of places. So hospitals, I think you'll see it. A doctor or nurse is not touching you without having a pair of gloves on. It's kind of standard practice, keeps infection rates down. It's different than the masks or the gowns, right? It's standard procedure. Whenever you see a doctor or nurse, they're putting on gloves to touch you. But they're also used in our food processing facilities. They're used in, the back of your grocery stores for all the meat packing. They're used in, our semiconductor industry that we're trying to stand up. We're spending hundreds of billions of dollars to build these, state-of-the-art fabs. And what do all those workers wear? Full PPE with sterilized gloves. Well, guess where all of those sterilized gloves come from? China.
And what happened when the pandemic hit? Was that supply chain massively disrupted like a lot of others?
Yep. It was, again, everyone saw it firsthand. Is, you had a, regional concentration of a critical item, being made in Malaysia, Thailand, Vietnam. At the time, China was only supplying around 14% of our gloves, but they realized, hey, here's another critical item that we can try and control and take over, and that's exactly what they did. And in a short, 2-year time frame, they went from supplying 14% of our gloves to 50. And they also took over the raw material market. So now they're selling the raw, nitrile butadiene rubber and the precursor chemicals to the Malaysian, Thai, and Vietnamese factories. So, you take it all together, China controls probably 90+% of our nitrile gloves right now.
So heading into the pandemic, what stage of development of your company were you at?
Again, we were pre-revenue. We had all of the existing, we had the talent, we had the technical knowledge to do it, but, we didn't have the capital. And then, what happened during the pandemic was the government opened a couple of programs. We were the first glove manufacturer that they deemed credible to, kind of make gloves. So at the time, it was the Development Finance Corporation teamed up with HHS. They saw our plan, gave us a green light. Then they came back to us about 2 weeks later and they said, hey, we see long term, you want to be vertically integrated and make both the raw material and the gloves. If we gave you more money, can you do both? We said, absolutely. They said, okay, you're now one big, vertically integrated project. Let's go forward. Then about, 30 days into that process, HHS was then teamed up with the Department of Defense for a separate program, which were grants instead of loans. And we were told to apply to the DoD. But they said, well, the DoD is a little different. You have to give, one proposal for the chemical manufacturing for the raw material, one proposal for the glove manufacturing. We said, well, how do we take one big project and tear it in half? There's, kind of common, shared costs. We can't just, take the budget, rip it in half and apply. So, no, DFC said, don't worry about it. Whatever you do or don't get from the DoD, we, the DFC, will make up the difference. So get a contract from the DoD to build the chemical facility, then go back to the Development Finance Corporation. And for whatever reason, they couldn't get out of their own way, and they didn't give us a loan for the remainder of the project.
Wow. So where does it stand now?
So it stands now is, we successfully completed the contract. We built a facility capable of producing 90,000 metric tons of NBR. We just didn't hook it up to any of the utilities because they were take or pay contracts. So, the minute you signed it, you were going to have to owe, a bunch of money for gas or electric or water or whatever it was. And we gave them the choice. We said, hey, we can either get a third of the facility up and running or just, buy all the equipment, put it in the building, and whenever you decide to finish it, we can finish it. Government decided to choose the latter, to have, all the equipment, but, not have it be operational.
So it seems like it's sort of almost a reserve, ready to use if needed type thing at this point?
Not quite, because again, we still need about 9 months to, finish all of those hookups. And then we need to train a staff of about 100 people to work in the facility.
Okay, well, we got to take a quick break here and we'll be back with Scott. Go off, pay a couple bills. This is Home Talk USA on the King Broadcasting Network. This is the Made in America Hour. I'm your host, Greg Owens. We'll be right back. Welcome back, everybody, to Home Talk USA on the King Broadcasting Network. This is the Made in America Hour. I'm your host, Greg Owen, and I'm here with Scott Maier from Blue Star. Before we get back with Scott, I wanted to give a shout out to our host for this segment, Green Products. Protect your wood from future damage with copper green wood preservative. You can find them at greenproductsco.net. Scott, welcome back. And I tell you what, I own a flatware company and we have a DoD contract, and there are times now I really appreciate having the contract, and it's kept our business going for quite a few years, but boy, trying to navigate through the bureaucracy can be quite a challenge, can it?
Absolutely, it can. Yeah, government contracting is not an easy thing to do.
Well, and we had a meeting the other day, the Office of Management and Budget, which is one of these departments that the general public isn't that familiar with, but it's actually a very important department within government. They have an office called the Made in America office, and I think it was started during Trump 1.0. It continued during the Biden administration, but it basically became a waivers office at that point. And Trump has hired a bunch of people, including one of my old colleagues from the Coalition for a Prosperous America, to head up this office. And they seem pretty dedicated towards returning it to its original goal, which was to help resolve and facilitate projects like yours and bring jobs back through the DoD and through government contracts to sort of jumpstart the American manufacturing renaissance. Have you had any contact with them and any success?
I have, yeah, and yeah, Michael Stumo and his deputy Joanna Wisher, they're kind of huge champions for our project. They really want to get this whole nitrile glove industry up and running in the U.S. and not have it be just a little niche. Right now there's only about 3 or 4 companies that are making gloves, and we have no raw material being made. And they're trying to navigate kind of enforcing the Make BP in America Act, which again, that kind of legislation that came out of COVID. And again, this is a bipartisan issue, right? Everyone said at the time, this can never happen again, where doctors and nurses don't have the critical items they need. And unfortunately, a lot of money was thrown at the problem, but there just wasn't enough follow-up to make sure that these companies had the follow-on purchase orders to keep themselves going. As everyone has a short-term memory, and once the crisis is over, we'll just go back to business as normal and buy the cheapest product that was out there that we can find.
Well, and one of the issues that we talked with them about was there are existing laws in place, TAA compliance being one of them, Trade Act compliance. You can't just buy things from any country. They have to be on a list of 7 countries if they need to be TAA compliant. There's this micro purchase thing where a purchase is under $10,000. You can buy whatever you want. There's all sorts of loopholes in the Berry Amendment. I kind of get the feeling that with Michael and Juliana in charge, they're really getting serious about enforcing existing law and then taking steps to strengthen it. Do you get that sense as well?
I do. Yeah, I think, this is something they're extremely passionate about. And like I said, the laws are the laws, and there shouldn't be waivers. There shouldn't be exemptions. The whole point of this is to really make sure that, we keep this industrial base going. While the government, is not going to be a behemoth purchaser, even if it's a 5 to 10% of a company's revenues, it's, a decent amount that can keep, especially some of the smaller companies, going in times of need.
Well, and like in your case, this is an opportunity for the government to actually incubate a new company that's going to go out and resolve a national security issue. Because how quickly would our hospitals shut down if they didn't have a supply of gloves? I mean, it would.
Yeah,
6 weeks.
and this is the scary thing. I mean, again, it's another kind of trade lever for China, where they can literally shut down our healthcare system in about 45 days. The Strategic National Stockpile only has a 10-day supply of gloves that are either currently expired or about to expire, as they were bought back in 2021.
Right. And are you familiar with Rosemary Gibson?
Yep, very familiar.
Rosemary wrote that book, China RX. And if you haven't read that book, it's not entertaining. It's actually kind of frightening how quickly our whole healthcare system could be shut down because of our dependency on everything from aspirin to penicillin from overseas.
Yep. And again, it's the same thing with the medical consumables. So the nitrile gloves, your gowns, your masks, your IV tubing, your wound care items, if you look at kind of the top 20 kind of medical consumable items, blood vials, syringes, all of those things, China has at least a 50% market share. And again, in general, a majority of all those items are imported.
Well, and Michael and I, when we do the first segment, we do talk a little bit of politics, but I've always said this show's more about policy than politics. And, it's easy for a politician to stand up and say, rah, 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 make it in America. But when you go back in behind the scenes with all these loopholes, it just never seems to work out the way that they, talk about it in the media. So I'm just hopeful that now things are changing. we're starting to hear from the rank and file, in the procurement of flatware, which is the silverware, our industry, that, oh yeah, every day we hear made in America, buy American. And the mood is really changing in Washington behind the scenes, away from the TV cameras. So do you have any sense that that's going to get you across the finish line with financing your project?
We hope so. I think the difficulty is when you're dealing kind of, with interagency. So like you said, OMB is a, champion, but, now you've got a liaison with DOD, potentially other agencies that have funding mechanisms. The biggest thing for us is just finding the capital, right? Because, our project, just to finish our, raw material facility is about $60 million. And then to build just one glove facility is 150. But again, the whole goal of, when this nitrile ecosystem was started was to have a 25 to 30% quote unquote safety valve. And, if you take that, that's almost 15 to 20 modern factories at $150 million each. That's a lot of capital. And, again, there's a huge gap in the financing market where, this is too big for traditional VC, because it's pre-revenue, it doesn't really qualify for private equity. And there are really no kind of government, funding mechanisms out there right now.
Is it too big for the SBA?
Much too big for the SBA. Yeah, the SBA, typically, their sweet spot is, $1 million for small business. If you're a middle market company with, kind of greater than 50 million in revenue, you can look in, somewhere between 10 to 25 million, but, that's about it.
So you have this massive project that you need to get funded, too big for the SBA. Do you have a rich uncle, or what's the plan here?
The plan is, kind of keep doing what we're doing with, the folks in DC and, keep advocating. And again, hopefully something will, pop up and get us over the finish line.
Well, when we first started out, we bought the Oneida Limited plant, which was a huge factory. We didn't have any sort of the investment numbers that you're looking at, but what we did have was a contract, and it was just a contract with Oneida. It was a private company, but I would think that a contract with the United States government for millions of dollars in purchase orders over a 5 to 10 year period would be a significant advantage trying to raise the capital to pull something like this off. Is that?
Yeah. And I think that's part of what OMB is trying to do, is kind of aggregate the government purchasing. I think one of the problems they're having, though, is getting a good view on what exactly it is the government purchases. They had a white paper that came out about a year ago, and, according to the white paper, the government in total only bought about 3 billion gloves. And the biggest anomaly there was the VA health system, where they said, oh, we buy 700 million. And, for a hospital system that has 1,200 centers to only use 700 million gloves makes no sense. As an example, Michael Stumo had a, powwow a few weeks ago. He brought in one small health system that had about 200 centers, and they use between 1.1 to 1.3 billion gloves.
All right. Well, we'll be right back. We got to take a quick break here. This is the Made in America Hour on Home Talk USA. Be right back. Welcome back, everybody, to Home Talk USA on the King Broadcasting Network. This is the Made in America Hour. I'm your host, Greg Owens, here with Scott Maier, and we're talking about funding projects that are important for our national and economic security. Before we get back with Scott, I'd like to give a shout out to Aztec Washer, our sponsor for this segment. Revolutionary and innovative roofing products since 1968. Their motto is seal it right, seal it tight. You can find them at aztecwasher.com. Well, Scott, here we are. We're looking at an issue that is critical to our national security, is particularly in the light that China has taken over this industry and can hold it against us as we attempt to decouple going forward. But we're sort of at an impasse, and the Industrial Finance Corporation is something that you pointed out as a potential mechanism to help fill this gap and incubate a business that really needs to be in existence, right? before it could even think about scaling up to the quantities of products that we need where we cut off in a situation. I always like to go back to the example of there's no one in the United States that can build a toaster, right?
Mhm.
We've lost that complete industry. It's kind of a joke thing, but if we had to invent a toaster, you'd have to find somebody that started with a blank sheet of paper and invented an industry. You don't have any base industry to scale up. So what we really need to do, obviously, is get you guys going so that you have a nice solid base to begin with. And how could the Industrial Finance Corporation help achieve that?
Yeah, again, and I think the point of the Industrial Finance Corporation would be kind of a government-sponsored lending vehicle, kind of similar to the way the SBA loans work, but they would partner with large banks. The banks would vet the businesses and then make these kind of large long-term loans to these industries we want to reshore. There's a lot of industries that are just extremely capital intensive. Again, if you want to build a modern factory, you're probably looking at anywhere from a $10 million plus effort, and that's not going to the SBA. There's and like we said, there's that gap in the financing market where it's VC doesn't like hardware, and PE you have to have revenue. So I think having an industrial fund, sponsored, or government backed would really help jumpstart all these critical industries we want to reshore to get them building the factories and then getting the capacity. I think we've seen with the nitrile gloves, there is demand in the private market, but the reason that the large buyers like your kind of Cardinals and Medlines, and the big GPOs haven't been buying from the factories that are making gloves in the U.S. is that they're still importing the raw material, and they've told those companies like, hey, whether it's a finished glove on a boat or your raw material on a boat, I'm going to have a supply chain disruption if there's a hiccup. And, hey, it's great that you built a factory to make the finished product, but we need to have the whole ecosystem on shore for it to be truly resilient. And until it's truly resilient, we're not going to commit to buying your product.
Right, and a lot of the in the drug industry, a lot of the near term, or I guess emergency situation thing was to create a stockpile, but there's only a certain amount of capacity, and doubling the capacity of, for example, the raw materials isn't going to happen overnight, and it's not sustainable. And then, you mentioned something that there's an expiration date on these products. I would assume on the raw material and the finished product. What is that? That surprises me that it would be that short, but apparently it's a critical issue.
Yeah. For nitrile gloves, it's a 510K regulated item, and typically it's 3 to 5 years, depending how it's stored.
So there is a significant stockpile that you could create, but it would take potentially years to do that with existing capacity worldwide.
Well, exactly. I mean, again, to have like a 60 to 90-day stockpile, which is what you should have, with our current capacity of glove manufacturing in the U.S. of about 2 billion gloves, that's a almost a 20 to 30-year endeavor, unless we build more capacity.
So another organization that could get involved in this is the President's American Manufacturing Council. Have you participated in that?
I have not, but Trump had it in his first administration, and I think it would be great if he would revive it, because what I've found, and we've done a lot of lobbying the last 2 years, is there really aren't any folks that are CEOs and people on the ground of industry that are advising politicians. It's all lobbyists and think tank people that have never worked in a factory, been in a factory, understand how factories work. And again, I think getting that, from the ground input would be extremely helpful.
Oh, I couldn't agree more. And I think we probably bring that issue up about every week on this program. It's you go down to DC and you're lobbying and you're talking to lawyers and bankers and lifetime career politicians who have never made a Tinker toy. And they just have no concept. It's not that they're dumb people. They're very smart, but they've never been what I like to call in the trenches, actually trying to get it done. And they could certainly use some input from people with real world experience, right?
Yeah. Like again, I think it was, Michael Bloomberg put out a paper a couple of months ago talking about, Factory 5.0 that can make, any item, any time, at any capacity. And it's like, do you understand how factories work? They just don't spit out widgets. There's inputs that go into this, and there's assembly, and then there's a final product. It's not just some magical building that is going to spit out, DoD missiles, from midnight to 2 a.m. and then from 3 a.m. to 5 a.m. make car parts.
Right.
Factories don't work that way.
It's sort of like the whole free trade thing. It works great in academia, but when you put it into practice in the real world, what you find out is that Milton Friedman was a little off when he made all of his predictions.
Yeah.
But I tell you what, this is a great conversation. We have run out of time. We're going to have you back to close this up. I thank you for being here, Scott, on Home Talk USA.
Appreciate you having me. Thank you.
All right. And this has been the Made in America Hour. We will look forward to seeing everybody next week. Take care.